Was there a sheet with different people on it?
This is it, right here.
Yeah, but the question at the bottom here, maybe I can't.
Oh, no, that was an idea I had for.
Oh, okay, I thought, I was like, I'm missing the part where it has those.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha, okay, I'm sorry.
So, I was gonna choose 6 people and then, designate them and see if people could figure out who they are, but we're gonna do this instead.
Okay, gotcha.
Where, I just randomly choose one and people can interrogate me to see what I believe.
So people have to start asking you questions then?
Exactly, you just go through the questions on the list. So, I'm gonna pick randomly one of these worldviews, and you figure out what I believe. Just start from the top and start asking questions.
Do you think truth exists?
Yes.
Do you think God exists?
Yes.
Is he infinite, finite, or infinite?
Do you think there's one God or many gods?
Look, let me follow his questioning first. Infinite.
Yeah, ask yourself that. So, or,
It's okay. It was implied, yes.
No, you're gonna check.
Alright, so you write it, my last answer was infinite. I think there is one God, and that God is infinite. What's your next question?
do you think the New Testament is reliable?
Whoa.
Isn't that the nexus is really the foundation of the world?
Think about
You
it.
said if infinite, as you think the universe is God.
Do you think the universe is God?
Yes. What am I?
Pantheist.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
So Bill, have you found that everyone specifically claims to be one of these, or they don't know, but you
This-
categorize them?
It's a very general thing, but this was part of our session where Mr. Hood went through this hierarchy of the 7 basic worldviews. And so I just put it into a Q&A kind of format for you to kind of diagnose along with these 4 major arguments. Thank you, sir.
No, what I'm asking is the people you encounter, do they
They generally fall into
educational
those.
say that I am a theist or a deist or this and that?
Sometimes people don't know what they
Okay,
are.
that's what I was asking.
And you've got to figure it out.
Okay.
They'll say, I believe this, I believe that, and you'd say, what are you? And they say, well, I don't know. So it's like, you've got to figure it out for them. Do you believe the universe is God? Yes. Then you're a pantheist. Oh, I am? Oh, okay. You know?
That's what I was.
So, a lot of times people don't even know what the name of what their belief is. This is from last week, and this thing is the kind of the general arguments that we use once we isolate exactly where they are. Let's try another one. Good morning.
Thank you.
We got a whole crew now.
Okay.
For everybody that just came in, Bill's got this diagnosis tool, which is just questions that you can ask somebody kind of walking through to kind of figure out where they are in their journey or their belief system, right, what they believe. So this tool is really good because if you're going to lead anybody to Christ, you know, what was it that I said? If you want to lead somebody to where you are, what do you need to do?
Know where they are.
Yeah, actually, I should say, Augustine only said it, so I shouldn't claim credit for it. But, he said if you want to lead somebody to where you are, you have to walk over where they are, take them by the hand and walk them over, right? Because I'll give you a good example. So one of my professors in seminary went to a debate at Harvard. And it was organized, and the topic was, is Jesus God? Or you know, and so you think about that topic, and he went, and one of the girls who organized it, a Harvard girl, was there, and after the debate, you know, he pretty much, you know, leveled the guy that he was debating, right? And so the girl who put this on came up and was talking to him afterwards and said something about, oh, well, you know, that was amazing, that was great. And he said, oh, so you found those, you know, that compelling and stuff. And she's like, oh yeah, it was great. And he said, so you believe Jesus is God? And she goes, oh, I don't believe there's a God. So he really quickly understood that if you prove that Jesus is God, that doesn't do much for you if you don't believe there's a God. And another example, same kind of circumstance. So Bill, the last person that he decided to be when we were testing him was a pantheist, right? Well, if you're with a pantheist and you prove that Jesus is God, that doesn't do a lot because they believe that everything is God, right? A stick's God, mud is God. So Jesus, hey, yeah, Jesus is God too. But that's not what we mean by that, right? So if you don't really understand where they are, explaining that Jesus is God to a pantheist, that sure, they'll agree with you all day long. They also think they're God, and that the boxes on the table are God. So this diagnostic tool really helps you kind of start where that person is and lead them over to the truth. So what Bill was doing is he was just kind of randomly picking one of the 7 major worldviews and deciding that he was going to be that, and then we were able to use this tool and ask him questions. So he's going to pick another one, I think, and so now you guys have to ask him and figure out where he is.
Okay.
Yeah. He's gonna scream at you, so.
I'll pick one, try to figure out what I believe. You just start at the top and start asking questions.
Do you think truth exists?
Yes. You can keep going.
Do you think God exists?
The same person can interrogate it all the way through to figure out.
Let's go, Ethan.
He stumped you there, didn't
You start.
I'm stumped already.
Okay. So
Do you believe in one God? Or many gods?
well,
Oh, my fault. Do you think God exists?
yes.
There we go. Do you believe in one God or many gods?
One God.
Do you think God is finite or infinite?
Infinite.
Do you think the universe is God?
No.
Do you think God performs miracles?
No.
You're a deist.
Right. So what is a deist?
It's a God that doesn't interact in the world.
Exactly. Right. So the question can tell you, help you understand what that is. But these are, what I've found is you've got to figure out, you got to diagnose where a person's at before you launch into things. and going back, this is something that we talked about last week, are the arguments that we build as a part of apologetics. Before we get to the gospel, we try to establish that truth exists, and then God exists. The New Testament, miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable. And this is the same way that your faith will be challenged. You'll say, I believe in Christ, and people will say, well, truth doesn't even exist. How can you, what? That Christianity is meaningless. And you've got to know why. Why do you believe truth even exists? So that's why this other paper is here. This paper, this little house that I've built, and you see you got these foundational pieces, and then the gospel is like a little roof on top. And then the first one here is an explanation of why we think truth exists. These are short summary explanations. The next page is different reasons we think God exists. Miracles in the New Testament. So this is a way to systematically go through knowing for yourself why you believe in Christianity, as well as explaining it to someone else. So let's try this one more time. I've chosen one. Who wants to figure out who I am? What I believe.
Do you think truth exists?
No, I'm an agnostic. Okay. Now, if I'm an agnostic, go over to this paper right here, and I say, truth doesn't exist. What would you say to me? Right. Yeah. Somebody says, there is no truth, and see what's written here, we use the laws of logic to prove to somebody that truth exists. The law of non-contradiction. That law is one of the most, Aristotle said it was the most basic law of logic, that you couldn't know anything without the law of non-contradiction, because the law of non-contradiction says two ideas that are opposite each other can't both be true at the same time. So it forces you to choose. And the person that is saying to you, there is no truth, is trying to tell you something that's true. It's a declarative statement. A declarative statement is when you try to tell somebody something that's a fact, something that's true. So in the very act of saying there is no truth, they're actually saying it's true that there is no truth. So you see those opposites. They can't both be true, because does truth exist and it doesn't exist? That's not logically possible. And that's how we know that truth exists. Because any attempt to deny truth only confirms it, because what you're saying is, this is true. So that is, if you run into somebody who tells you something like that, and that's how we establish this first foundation. There's absolutely truth exists. And then you can move on from there. What I've found is these two foundations tend to be the most important to understand these two arguments. Because usually once you convince somebody that God exists, as C.S. Lewis said, the cat is out of the bag. Miracles are possible once God exists. But we have arguments to explain why we think miracles are possible, and that then the New Testament is reliable. But these two I found, at least in our society today and on college campuses, are the two that we need to understand the most.
And-
There,
Let me say, one other thing about the truth piece too, is that, what you're gonna find is that you need to be ready for one step more too, when they talk about truth. Because some people will say, yes, truth exists, but they'll have a very different definition of truth, right? So they'll say, well, yeah, I believe there's truth, but what's true for you is true for me. I have my truth. There's pragmatic truth, which is if it works, it's true. We live in that world today where science and engineering kind of rule the roost, and so it's like, well, truth is what works, right? And so we have to be able to get back not only that truth exists, but that a correspondence with truth exists, right? That truth is what corresponds to reality, that there's a connection to the outside world, that truth is what corresponds to reality, and that we can know that, right? And that's what you really mean. It's the same thing when we go up these lists. We have to understand our definition of those things, right? To prove that God exists, we have to prove that the right God exists, truth exists, the right truth, and so forth.
right, in order to move on to miracles, we need to establish that a kind of God that does miracles exists. And the person that says, I had this conversation with a dean at VCU who has a PhD, who's an official in charge of things at the university, and he was talking about my truth and your truth, and he's like, well, what are you talking about? I said, I'm talking about the laws of logic, and he's like, well, that's your truth. I'm like, the laws of logic are true for both of us. They're not just true for me. This is a guy who has so bought in. It doesn't matter what levels of education you can achieve. If you get deceived somewhere along the way, no amount of education can correct that. And you don't need a whole lot of education to figure these things out for yourself if you really take the time to think. And just this correspondence idea of truth, even the person that talks about this is your truth and this is my truth, what they're saying is they're stepping back and saying, my idea that everybody can have their own truth actually corresponds to reality. So they're saying, when they say, no, everybody has their own truth, they are saying, I know what's true. And what's true is that everybody has their own truth. It is a trick, a mental, psychological trick that you have to be alert to. Do you see how that works? They're saying, I know what's really true. I know what really corresponds to reality, and it is the fact that everybody has their own truth. So they're always reaching back and saying they know that you're wrong, and so just be mindful of that.
I think too, just to say something real quick, like with people, like how do people come to that conclusion that's so absurd? And I think when people deny God and try to operate without God in academic institutions, it becomes impossible to achieve the synthesis of truth. And so there's always going to be this conflicting thought. And so this is just my opinion, and Francis correct, but like Francis Schaeffer, sorry. When there is no God, it becomes impossible to have one version of truth, and so this is what they end up with.
It gets very confusing, the person that says that morality is relative, like it can be different for everybody, that kind of idea is just a way to avoid being moral. Because if I say, all morality is relative, and I believe, I think, you should be good to people, but as long as I think morality is relative, I can then turn around and say, but in this certain situation, I can justify being cruel to that person. That's how moral relativity works, is it depends on your feeling that day, and you can shift it back and forth. And what happens is that moral relativity undermines civility, it undermines the rule of law, it undermines any idea that rules always apply to everyone. And that, once you take away God, that it's just whatever you feel like doing that day. And people tend to not want to do what's right, so society descends into chaos.
Now, what would you all do with that argument? Now, think about the similar things. It sounds like it's a trick, but the argument that he just gave, but how would you approach that? If people said, well, morals are relative. Think about the same thing that we kind of use with, that truth is my truth and your truth. What would you say if somebody said morals are relative?
I feel like there's certain set of morals that applies to everyone, and it's evident throughout society. But there's certain, every set of cultures, even when they're disconnected from society, do believe like murder is wrong, and that would be evidence of a absolute morality that applies to everyone, not just like a relative morality. Like there's like certain things that we can, that is shown like in humanity, that we can know certain things about morality.
Yeah, and even just stepping back one step, right? Well, everything you said, I think is 100% right. The question is, when I say that morals are relative, even before that, what am I saying? I'm saying, I'm making a moral claim, right? That's either relative or it's absolute, right? So if my claim that morals are relative, I would ask, is that an absolute moral claim? Right? I mean, that's the problem. One of the challenges, it sounds like it's a little trick, but the problem is that if we say that these things that we believe are grounded in reality, the problem that everybody else has in all of the other 7 worldviews is that in order to carry out life and live life like a normal human being, somewhat, they might have all these weird views, but they borrow from a Christian worldview all the time. Just like when they said, well, truth is relative. They say, well, I'm absolutely sure that truth is relative. That's just dumb, right? Or morals are relative. They're absolutely sure one moral truth is that truth is relative. Or that morals are relative. Everybody ends up borrowing from our Christian worldview. And so it's funny because when you go, at school or in university and like these educators, they'll try to rip these foundations out from underneath you, but the whole time they're doing it, they're standing and borrowing on your foundations.
Right.
And you just have to call them out for it. So the reason I brought it up is I want you guys to see that. I want that to just become so obvious that it's like, well, that's silly, right? Just their claim alone is just silly to you.
There's a story that some professors use that describe religion as like a bunch of blind men around an elephant, right? And one blind man holds on to the leg of the elephant and says, this is a stool. And another, holds on to the trunk and says, no, this is a hose. And one holds on to the ear. And they say, all these different religions just have a piece of the truth. And the person telling the story is telling it, saying that he is the only person that sees, and he sees everything, and everybody else doesn't see, but only their one little piece. So again, a lot of these things come back to this law of non-contradiction, and it's gonna take some time to really think about how to use that law and how these statements that people use to manipulate you violate that law. And once you kind of latch on to that, the person that says all morals are relative is saying it is absolutely true and morally right that, morality is relative. So they keep coming back. They stand on a foundation saying, I know what's true, and I'm telling you there's no truth, there's no morality, there's no meaning, because they are coming at you as if they're the only person that knows the truth. So be careful of that trick, and it's easy to get confused. And also remember that the things that people tell you, if they make a statement, don't just accept that statement, challenge that statement. Say, why do you believe that? Where does that come from? How do you justify that?
I'll give you a big example of that one. That if as you learn, this is a really good example for you guys. So you'll hear people say that's your perception, right? You have your perception, and then you have the real world out there, and they will believe. And this is very common today, that what you have is the thing in yourself, in your head, and I think I said before that Immanuel Kant, who you think, who cares who that is, but this guy has affected the way you think maybe more than Jesus has. You don't realize that, because his philosophies have been so ingrained down into our world that he said, hey, there's what you know, and then there's the real world, and there's a gulf in between, right? Well, those things have come out, and you hear it all the time, where it's like my perception is reality. Yeah, say that to somebody who's walking down a train track and doesn't think there's a train behind them. Their perception's not reality. That train will run them into the ground like mush, right? So, but people will talk about your perception, and what Bill just made the comment is challenge those questions, right? Because if somebody says to you, for example, well, you have your perception and then there's a reality, ask them a simple question. Well, how do you know they're different? Why should I just accept that they're different? I have a perception and there's a reality, but it's up to you to prove to me that it's different. Because remember, you know what they're saying about reality? They're saying that their perception of reality is that you can't know it.
That they know the truth.
Right? And here's the other thing too. If I tell you that, and this is important because this is at the core of so many things that people will try to steal your faith from. They'll say, that's just your truth or your perception and my perception. Right? And immediately they're just assuming that those two things are different. Right? But how can they know they're different? Right? If I believe there's a God who created my mind to know the world, then I would just assume that yeah, we're not always going to be 100% accurate, but God has created my mind to know the world. That's how I live in it, right? But if they say, well, no, you have what's in your mind and what's in the world, and those things are different. Remember that if I told you that this and this are different, right? I say, this is your perception and this is reality, and they're different. Now I look at those, are they different? How do I know they're different? But how do you know that they're different? What do you have to know about these things to say they're different?
Perception.
I have to know this, and I have to know this to tell you that they're even different. Right? So for somebody to tell me that reality and what my perception is, or that your perception and reality aren't the same, they are saying, I know something about this and this to know they're different. Well, that's exactly what they're saying they can't do, is know something about this. If this is reality, They say, oh, these things are different. I say, you can't know they're different unless you know it, which disproves your point. So don't just accept those questions or those positions, right? Ask and think about those things. Don't just say, oh, your perception or you can't know reality. Don't let somebody sell you that bag of goods without putting them on the table. And like I said, if you trip it, if you flip it and it trips it, their argument, then you would be silly to believe, right? And yet they do. So don't just, like Bill made a great point, don't just accept things, question them.
All right, let's do one more. Who wants to figure out what I believe?
Somebody who hasn't gone, you can do this.
Does everybody understand how to use it? Ask questions, go down through it. I'll just say that atheists and other people that are moral relativists will tend to be predatory in the way that they deal with you. And if you show them that you are compliant and you'll just accept whatever they say, they're gonna take advantage of you. And you're gonna be a victim and manipulated. So I encourage you to be bold. Everything that I'm saying, you should be questioning what I'm saying. And ask me to prove what I'm saying. Don't just say, oh, this guy's a teacher or whoever is a teacher. I just, take whatever they say. You should challenge it. Why do they think that? Where do they come up with that? All right. Somebody who hasn't tried it yet.
I think truth is relative.
Yes.
Do you think God exists?
No. What am I?
Probably not.
What's that?
No, you said,
I said, no, I don't believe God
Oh,
exists.
sorry.
See, it drops down to the corresponding down here.
Oh, then you're atheist.
That's right.
Yep.
Exactly. So, then what does it say after atheist?
Acceptance for Jesus God.
Okay, so that would take us to this sheet, the second foundation. Arguments for the existence of God. Somebody read that first paragraph for me.
Does it start with once?
Yes.
Once we establish that truth exists, we must then establish that reasons of making a person would conclude that God exists. Arguments for the existence of God include philosophical and scientific arguments. These arguments are constructed without reference to the authority of the Bible.
Okay. So you don't need the Bible to establish that truth exists, you need logic. To establish that God exists, you don't need to have the Bible either. You can look outside the Bible, and in fact, in the book of Romans, it says that God has made the world in such a way that when you investigate it, you will determine that it was designed by a superior mind. And so, the first arguments are philosophical, using logic, and what you see here is this first one, the argument from necessity. Sometimes it's called the argument from contingency or being. And there's a summary of what that argument is. Under there it says references. If you want more on it, the Apologetics Session 5 Mr. Hood went over that. And the last page has QR codes to all those sessions that were recorded. Session 5, if you put your phone over this QR code, it'll take you right to that video. You can look at what he said about that argument. Also, within this booklet, the section on cosmos has reference to this argument. The argument from evil, also Apologetics, session 8. Scientific, those are the two philosophical arguments that we've talked about. Two scientific arguments, the fine-tuning of the universe and biological information. So, you live in a universe that has been fine-tuned. This is not a Christian idea. Atheists, agnostics, theists all agree. Top-level scientists, Stephen Hawking, one of the most well-known scientists, physicists in the world, who was an atheist, talked about and wrote about the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, as an atheist, he believed that that fine-tuning was just the result of a multiverse, that this universe just happens to be one of an infinite number of universes that happens to be perfect for life to exist. But the fine-tuning of the universe is something that, if there are no infinite number of universes outside of this universe, which we can't really know since we're inside this universe and we can't observe things outside the universe, then the fact that this is like a Goldilocks universe points to the idea that it has been fine-tuned. Someone went in and they adjusted the strength of gravity and electromagnetism and the forces that govern the nucleus of the atom, the speed of light. All those things have to be exactly what they are in order for life to exist on a planet like this. And when, yes, sir.
Let me finish what you're doing. I'll go back.
And, well, I was just then gonna go on to biological information.
So what happens when a question comes, other than saying that the universe was created for, how about the universe, or creation is the result of the perfect universe? So where do you go from there when they go, well, no, only life exists because the perfect scenario exists, or life adapted to
that
it?
kind of anthropic principle?
Yes, I'm debating you with that question. I'm not debating you.
Right.
But I'm coming back with well, how come life exists because it's a perfect scenario?
Right, what he's bringing up is, the atheist will say, well, we only know that, this is perfect because we just happen to be beings that exist in a universe that's perfect for us, just like the water in a puddle perfectly fills up the empty hole underneath it. That kind of a argument is, I think, that most even atheists that that understand that is not enough of an explanation. Say, some people use the example, say you were convicted of a crime and that crime was punishable by death, and you're stood up in front of a firing squad of 50 marksmen who are excellent at what they do, and they've got you at point blank range, and they all shoot at you and they all miss. Now you could say, what? That's just a happy coincidence. Or you could say, they were not trying to kill you. So you get to the point where it's just ridiculous, the number of things that have to be in precise alignment. It's kind of like a combination lock, you know? Most of us have had a combination lock where, you know, you've got like a list of numbers, right? You know, different tumblers, and usually there's maybe 3 or 4 numbers, and you have to get them all right. You know, in order for the lock to open, you've got to get each number precisely right. Now, it's not just each individual thing, it's actually the combination, the combinatorial effort. So it's one thing if you can get one right, but then if you can get the probability of getting each one after that right is exponential, right? So the first one is 0 through 9, right? You got 1 in 10 chance there. But then you add another one, and it doesn't just go up by 10, it goes up to 100. Now you've got a 1 in 100 chance of guessing it. Then you add another one, exponentially again, now it's 1 in 1,000. So that's the thing, is like all of these things must line up. And the combination of all these things, the probability goes down to 0 that all these things would just happen to line up. So that would be my answer to that. So those are, and then biological information. Everything on this planet runs off of information. Your body runs off your DNA, which is a 3 billion character computer-like digital code.
The other thing too is, you know, we believe and have demonstrated that there is a God, and that God is an infinite God. Like, that must be the case, he's infinite. What atheists do, or a lot of times, is I think they rely on the God of infinity. Instead of God is infinite, they rely on the God of infinity. And what they do is they put so much in infinity that they just want to claim the word infinity, and then everything is possible.
Given enough time,
Yeah, so think about that.
everything's possible.
If we say that certain things happen by chance, they say, well, given all the chances, well, just add infinity and then anything can happen, right? But the reality is that what we see in the world over and over again is that chance behaves certain ways, but it doesn't produce information, right? I mean, a real specified complexity. So again, I use the example of Mount Rushmore. Nobody walks, you know, along and goes, look what happened by erosion and wind that just happened by chance to carve the faces of presidents on the side. Like, you look at that and go, that's information, that was an intelligent design, because we experience information in our world, and it always has an intelligent designer. And so they want to say, well, information comes with just given enough infinity of chances. But there's no explanation for that. Like, chance is not in itself enough, right? Just given ad infinity, or the God of infinity, now all of a sudden it can do things it couldn't do before.
So would, like, information may come with infinity, but so would disinformation or misinformation. So it's like, I mean, when you see Mount Rushmore, it's not like, oh, we've just had enough time for this to develop. Like, you get what I'm saying?
This idea of specified complexity is a term that this mathematician who had a PhD from the University of Chicago, which is probably this country's best university for mathematics and physics, or at least it was, and he came up with this thesis of the idea to actually figure out when to detect intelligent design and use that term, specified complexity. We only have a few minutes left here. This booklet, I've been going through and So what I do here is on page 7 here, I've got this list of things, and most of this booklet is focused on the skeptic who is saying there's no evidence for God, no evidence for a spiritual realm. And I go through and I demonstrate that logic, the laws of logic, are something that have always been true, which means they are eternal. They are not made of matter and energy, which means they are metaphysical or spiritual, right? So the same thing for the laws of mathematics, the same thing for the laws of ethics. These laws of thought are all eternal. They are all non-physical or spiritual. They are the most important ideas that human beings operate off of. And this section on knowledge talks about the logical arguments that we build based on logic. And those logical arguments of why we think we know anything at all are very important. And then the section on truth goes over the things we've talked about, truth as well. We use logic to prove truth. This section on science talks about the fact that science is completely dependent on philosophy. Philosophy includes logic, it includes ethics, it includes these theories of knowledge we call epistemology. You can't do science without philosophy. Philosophy is a foundation that science is built on. And then last week we talked about the cosmos, divine tuning, information, what we just talked about. And today we're going to briefly go over mind, meaning, and conscience. The mind, the characteristics of what we call the mind, our ability to be self-aware. Like we have this ability, we can actually step back from ourselves and judge ourselves as if we were like a different person. You ever said, man, you're stupid. Why did you do that? That was dumb. You shouldn't do that. That's self-awareness. That you're not just a being that operates, but you're someone that actually can step back from themselves and look at themselves as like objectively, like an independent person. And the ability to think freely